So we went to a friend's house for the Super Bowl, and we were talking about doing the lead pour video. It was right after that, and all of the comments we got about us dying of lead poisoning and poisoning the earth and all the terrible things that we've done by doing this. And the party was Sarah here, who's a friend of ours, and she started giving us all of this scientific information about lead that we did not know. And she was kind enough to come in and share some of that knowledge with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
My name is Sarah. I'm a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where I'm studying landscape architecture. And so in order to design the most sustainable and ecologically friendly landscapes, I've been studying phytoremediation, which is how plants can take up contaminants from the soil. I want to know how the water moves through the landscape and what plants could be used to remove contaminants from heavily contaminated sites. So lead is actually problematic in that regard. Lead, when it's in soil, binds really, really tightly to soil particles, and it's very, very hard once those bonds have been made for the lead to actually get into water. So once lead's in the soil, it mostly stays there, which is why when Steve and Alex were at the Super Bowl party and mentioned that people were concerned about lead contamination, I mentioned I had been studying lead and how we could remediate it, remove it from heavily contaminated sites with plants, and how that's actually very problematic. Lead, once it's in the soil, stays in the soil. In order to provide a little bit of context for my claims, I've researched some general standards in the state of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs developed the Massachusetts Contingency Plan numerical standards. These are standards of how much lead you could have in soil or water before it's problematic and needs to be remediated in some capacity. The levels for groundwater are very, very low. It takes only a little tiny bit of lead to be contaminated in water before you have a problem. So that would be about 15 parts per billion, which is a very, very small amount. However, it's extremely difficult for lead to get into water. The reason why lead poisoning and contaminated water has become prevalent and kind of a health scare in the nation is because old lead pipes were used for water. So you'd have lead pipes bringing water to people's homes for drinking water all the time, multiple times a day, every day, for years and years and years. And the lead would accumulate, and then you could get lead poisoning. On the other hand, when you have lead contamination in soil, the lead binds so tightly to soil particles that the standards for the MCP soil standards are much, much higher. So instead of the 15 parts per billion allowable before you have problematic lead levels in water, the levels for soil contamination are 200 parts per million if it was an active landscape where you're having a schoolyard where small children might be present, or agricultural use. For a residential yard, the allowable levels of lead contamination are 600 parts per million. So many orders of magnitude larger than what's allowable for water. And the reason that is because lead binds so tightly to phosphates, iron oxides, and clay soil particles that once it gets into soil, it stays there. However, in order for plants to uptake nutrients, it has to be soluble. Nutrients have to be dissolved in water. It's really the water that plants uptake in order to get the nutrients that they need. That's why lead is so hard to clean up from a site. In order to actually get it into plants when you want to get it into plants, you have to use chemical chelators, which you add to the soil to break the bonds between phosphates, iron oxides, clay, all the nutrients you have in the soil particles that the lead binds so tightly to. Unless you actively apply chelators, the lead is going to stay in the soil. So lead will not be taken up by plants, so it won't be present in any plant matter that grows there, whether it's meant for human consumption or not. There is a lower level allowed for specific uses just to be an extra precaution, and because there could be lead dust or contaminants in the top layers of soil that might physically get onto food. So if the food isn't being very carefully washed, or if you have small children playing in the very top levels of heavily contaminated dirt, that is problematic. However, in the situation that we have here, where they had a pour of lead into a wooden mold that was buried in soil, very, very little amount of that lead is actually going to come in contact with the soil, and if it did, it would bind very tightly to those particles and then stay there. Because I'm a graduate student at UMass, I have available the Center for Agriculture, Food, and the Environment, which is an outreach extension of UMass that actually provides soil testing. So for a small fee, anyone, including the guys here at Acorn to Arabella, can provide a soil sample and have it tested at the UMass labs in order to see levels of various contaminants or heavy metals, in this case, in their soil. So we can dig the soil samples around the pour site. Because we're testing for heavy metals, it's actually going to be a series of 12 subsamples that are dug at a depth of 6 to 8 inches and then mixed in a bucket, and 1 cup of that soil can then be brought to the UMass labs where they'll be tested for all of the different heavy metal contaminants. We can compare that to the MCP standards and see how this lead pour has impacted the soils here.
So thank you, Sarah, for coming and sharing some of your knowledge. And we're going to go outside here in a minute and get some soil samples, and Sarah will take those, and we'll find out exactly how much lead we put into the soil here. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about my blood. So there's a lot of concern about our blood levels with lead throughout this pour, because lead, you can inhale it, you can eat it, you can absorb it through your skin, and it is toxic. So I had the most contact with the lead throughout this entire process. I was the one that collected the wheel weights and dumped them into the tank and was inside the melting tank stacking the lead. I was the one that was the closest to the pour, keeping an eye on everything, while everyone else was far upwind and away. I did have a respirator on, but I do have a beard, so the respirator doesn't get as good a fit as it, would be ideal. So I went and got tested, figuring that since I have been exposed to way more lead than anyone else in this process, that if I was good, we could reasonably assume that everyone else was. So I sent a sample of blood in, and I got the test, and what we found out was that I have 7 micrograms per deciliter in my blood, which works out to about 70 parts per billion. And for a reference, in water, they make it so you don't want to have more than 15 parts per billion. So if my blood were drinking water, it would be kind of problematic. But for an adult, 7 is no big deal. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recommends that adults keep their blood level below 10 micrograms per deciliter, so I'm fine there. And they don't believe that symptoms occur till over 40. So there's a long, long way to go before we could even become symptomatic. And they don't do anything about it, any sort of therapy, usually until it's over 50, which we have a long ways to go. The reason that they're so stringent with water is that if you're a little kid and you're drinking the water every day and you're bathing in the water every day, you can get lead and it'll start to build up in your system. And it affects kids a lot worse than it affects adults. So if you ingest lead, it ends up getting into your blood and it kicks around in your blood for maybe 40 days or less. And then after that, it gets stored in your teeth and your bones, and it's a lot harder to get rid of. So if you're a little kid and your bones are developing and you have this access to the lead that's in your drinking water, it really does become a big problem, and that's where we see all these issues with the lead poisoning. For an adult, 7 micrograms per deciliter is well within the allowable amount and should pose no problems to me whatsoever down the road, and everyone else who is at the pour or in the general vicinity area should also be completely safe. All right, should we get some soil samples?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Other way. Oh, perfect.
Great.
Okay, here's the shovel. I'll let you do this, you're the expert. We buried the lead in there, and then we moved it over here, and we did a bunch of shaping over here. So
You buried the lead in here?
in here, yep. And we'll have to go outside and get access to the other part. But yeah, the lead keel came to about here. It was all buried in here. And then we moved it out here, and we did a bunch of flattening and shaping. So you might want to check the soil in here as well.
Okay. So this fill-in, where was that from?
Some of that was from in the hole, some of that was from around the hole.
All right, that's some wood. Was that part of the mold?
No, it was just some wood that was buried in there.
Okay.
Like we said, this was the site. There used to be a big old barn here that they burnt down a long time ago, and then they just dozed the rest of it over. So Lord only knows what's buried down there.
We took a bunch of subsamples, which is meant to be representative of the entire site that we're looking to measure here. Contamination doesn't occur evenly. It occurs in some areas there will be hot spots, other areas will have significantly less contamination. So by sampling multiple sites around the area that we're looking at, we can, and then mix them together, taking our sample from this, that's going to give us a better representation, understanding of the actual contamination that's gone on.
First off, big thanks to Sarah for coming and sharing her knowledge with us about lead and its remediation. And the results came in finally. It took a couple weeks for UMass to do all the soil samples, but we got the results, and they look pretty good. The lead levels, the heavy metal thresholds set by the US EPA, are 400 milligrams per kilogram in the soil. So 400, and from our soil samples, we came up with 46.9. So we are well below the threshold for lead. And where we did the pour is actually the site of an old barn. There used to be a huge 3-story barn here that stood for a very long time, and it was taken down before I was born. But just I'm sure that was painted in lead paint at some point, and that alone would be more than enough to get us values of 46.9. And then same thing with nickel, cadmium, chromium, zinc, and copper. We are all well below what the thresholds are set by the US EPA. So it doesn't seem like we did any real significant damage to ourselves or to the soil or to the neighbors. So although lead is certainly dangerous and it definitely is toxic and it's something to be careful of, it's not as bad as a lot of people think, and we did not poison ourselves or the entire town. Before we wrap this up, we want to put out a little call to arms, and we could use your help. So we have a lot of great timber for the boat, but there's one species of New England timber that we would really like to get our mitts on, and we can't really get it from a sawmill, and it's this wood called black locust. It grows native around here, especially along the river, so if you're anywhere near the Connecticut River, there's a good chance you have some around. And we're looking for a black locust tree or 6 that are about yay big around. So if you walk up to them and at chest height give them a hug and your hands just meet or don't quite meet, that's an awesome size locust, and that is what we are looking for. Our offer is to come to your home, to take your locusts, and we can clean up the mess. So I can borrow my friend Tom's equipment, and we can show up with the dump truck and the chipper. We can cut down the tree, we can chip all the brush and take it away, and I can even come back with the stump grinder and leave you with nothing but a bare patch of earth. So if you got some locusts and you'd like to get rid of it, we would love to take it and love to incorporate it into Arabella. So we're going to put in a little link here with some info so that you can identify black locusts. It's very important that it's black locust and not honey locust. But if you have some, and if you're willing to part with it, we would love to hear from you. And the other thing is you need to be within a 1-hour drive of us in Granby, Massachusetts. So the zip code is 01033. Please throw that into Google Maps or whatever you want to use and make sure you're within an hour. But if you're within an hour of us and you have some decent sized locusts, we really would love to hear from you.